if we talk about governments, if we talk about global financial regulation, we should not forget why is the system working. The system is working by people trust global or local financial systems. They bring the money to the bank and they think that the bank is doing the best with their money. Recently we did see that this is not always the case, but the regulators should not forget also to continue to control existing big brands and big names, although those brands help them to maintain a very high level of good feeling, of confidence into the financial system.
This is precisely because we live in a more complex world that we need tax competition. We need nation states to provide different environments for different types of investments and different types of entrepreneurs.
How do you convince politicians? I mean, you can go to most economics departments now, you can even go to the IMF and World Bank and places like that. For the most part, people understand what good tax policy is. The evidence is so strong about what should be done. But of course, governments have a different perspective, or at least the politicians representing governments have a different perspective. They want more money, they want more power, they want more control. This is why we have these efforts by some of the international bureaucracies to try to undermine tax competition, because they understand and they view from a negative perspective what I think is a very positive thing, and that's jurisdictional competition. When I go to my salary review at the Cato Institute, I'll do things like brag about we now have 25 flat tax jurisdictions in the world, and I'll pretend that has something to do with me. In reality, the politicians don't read our policy papers. They only do the right thing when they're forced to, or at least generally speaking, they do the right thing when they're forced to. And if you look at the positive changes that have happened around the world, and we saw some of them in Robert Mundel's speech earlier, on lower tax rates, why is that happening? In a few cases, like with Reagan and Thatcher, it was driven by a philosophical belief in lower taxes and more freedom. But in most cases, politicians are only lowering taxes and adopting flat taxes and reducing double taxation of savings and investment because of the pressure of good policy in other countries. And you can't create a global tax cartel without the U.S., just like you can't create OPEC without Saudi Arabia. And so if the U.S. moves to the left and winds up siding with France and Germany and other high-tax nations against tax competition, I do worry about that significantly. Now, let me go ahead and conclude by noting that there are some reasons for politicians not to worry, and this is what I try to tell them. They don't need to worry about losing as much revenue as they think. Why? Because you have Laffer curve effects. When you have high tax rates, as I mentioned before, you get a lot of evasion and a lot of avoidance. When you have lower tax rates, not only is there more compliance, but people work so you can invest more. There's a bigger tax base. And so as a result, we do have something known as the Laffer curve. The key thing is that tax competition is driving us to better policy and better results. And we need to make sure, if we want more economic liberalization, if we want higher prosperity and more freedom, we need to make sure that the OECD and the EU and other international bureaucracies aren't allowed to win the battle.
The basic idea is you should broaden the tax base, and secondly, you should basically bring the rules into a more uniform and more harmonized shape. So uniformity and simplicity. There is a third point actually, which is very carefully, well, actually not even mentioned by the Commission when dealing with this common consolidated corporate tax base, which is the second factor in the calculation, because taxes is the product, as we have heard, of the tax base, and secondly the tax rate. The Commission never addresses the rate. It rather insists on not even daring to think about touching the rate. So the rate should stay unharmonized, whereas the basis should be brought into a harmonized feature. History tells us that if we broaden the base and secondly, if we brought down the rate, this could easily even lead Laffer curve effect to an increased overall revenue. On a standalone basis, if you look on a country-by-country basis and screen countries, we would see, and history tells us, and the charts we saw underline it, that the tax to GDP ratio within OECD and the world would not be affected detrimental. The point is, I think that it may be questionable in a multi-country scenario with those 27 brothers and sisters would maybe sit down in the morning and harmonize the tax basis. And then, although literally not really yet starting to talk about the tax rate, they might be seduced to, in the afternoon, also sit down on a harmonization of tax rates. And if it's about 27 brothers and sisters, then they may also be seduced to maybe harmonize a tax rate on a relatively comfortably high level. The skeptics of the CCTB project very much feel that this could be the end of competition in Europe. So whenever we hear simplification or harmonization, we should be careful because typically from experience, I can personally tell us that it would not really work that way. It's rather going into an even more complex direction.
And when you look at the competition between Europe and the US, you see a much slower growth due to over-regulation and cost-cutting policy. We spend less on R&D in Europe, lack of investment incentives and taxation. We raise less external finance, access to funding and taxation, and surely have lower revenue because of taxation reasons.
My favorite euphemism for tax increase was from Senator Dole, who was the chairman of the Finance Committee, who said, "I'm not raising taxes, I'm improving the revenue mechanism."